2.
Amazing. Just let me know when it's all good.
Yep. Moment.
Yeah, I think it looks like it's live.
Has an amazing format.
Yeah, it's live. I will shut everyone's camera except yours.
Okay.
I didn't know much disagree with that. Okay.
Perfect.
Amazing. Okay, I'll get started then. So hi guys, my name is Olivia and I'm going to be running a workshop on how to judge. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay and you can see this all fine. If you're on the YouTube link and you can see on the live chat, there's a Google Doc there. That's going to be the workshop that I'm going to be using and the PowerPoint slides that I'll be referencing. So please do take a look at those. What I'm going to be covering is I'll start by going through a couple of the top rules and principles of judging. So I'll go through some of the biggest mistakes that I think people tend to make and some of the most important rules to remember. Before that, actually, just by way of introduction, I'll go through what a panel looks like and what the basic judging process goes and should look like for people that have never done a lot of judging before. And then at the end, I'll go through some tips in terms of writing notes or giving your feedback. And if anybody has questions at any time, then we can stop and we can focus on that. So the workshop is quite flexible. So if you guys want to chat about something else instead, then we can do that however way works for you. So starting with the basics of judging. So I understand that you guys want to go through a little bit of a judging workshop before your national tournament. So just to make sure that everyone is on the same page, normally what does the panel look like and what do the responsibilities look like for a debate? So throughout the debate, you may have several judges. One of those judges is going to be the chair of the panel. That's typically the most experienced judge. And the other judges are going to be what we call panelists or wings. All judges have a vote, and all judges should be taking very detailed notes throughout the debate, and they should be listening carefully to all of the teams to then make a provisional call when the debate ends. After the debate, you will have 15 minutes to come to a joint decision, which if possible should be unanimous, but it doesn't have to be. What that usually looks like is the teams leave the room. The chair will encourage all of the judges on the panel to look up their notes and think for 2 or 3 minutes and try to come up with a preliminary call. And then after that, you start having a discussion. And in those 15 minutes of discussion, the chair should be the one asking questions and the wings should be the ones answering questions. So you might have a question such as, well, firstly, what was your call? What was your decision for the debate? How would you place the 4 teams? And then they might ask you questions like, between opening government and opening opposition, why specifically do you think opening government beat opening opposition? And the role of the wings, of the panelists, is to answer those questions as much as possible. So for example, you might be really tempted to talk about one very clever thing that closing opposition said, but to make sure the discussion is organized and we focus only on the relevant things, please take it question by question and be as specific as possible. There's a maximum of 15 minutes, so it's possible that there will be disagreements and that there will be many views. So it makes sense to start by discussing the areas where you disagree on and start working from there. So for example, if everybody has one team first, but there is one person that has that team second, third, or fourth, perhaps it makes sense to start on that team. Or if you're perfectly split between whether one team has one or another team has one, it probably makes sense to start on that disagreement and spend less time on the areas that you all agree on. So basically, this is the summary of how the panel discussion usually works. The main challenge, if you're judging for your first time, and if you are a wing at a tournament for the first time, is always going to be specificity, is making sure that you can answer the questions that are asked of you with as much detail as possible. So rather than saying things like, this argument was convincing, or I thought this team was better, or this team was more structured, you want to point to very specific arguments they have given, or very specific points of rebuttal, and therefore justify why you think that they're beating another team or not. So that's basically how a panel works. If it's your first time judging, I'm going to go very quickly through the basic judging process and questions that you should ask yourself throughout the debate, because everything in this workshop might sound really technical and difficult. It actually isn't. There's just a couple of rules that we try to follow to make sure that we're only counting the right things and just to help us guide us. But at the end of the day, judging is all about the teams convincing you. And if you're not convinced, it is not your fault. It is the fault of the teams for not convincing you. So in summary, if you're judging for the first time, here is how you should go about it, something that helped me quite a lot to formulate my opinions and try to reach at least a preliminary call that later I might change. So in summary, you are trying to rank the 4 teams, first, second, third, and fourth. And any combination is possible in British parliamentary format. So you don't have to have proposition winning and opposition losing or vice versa. You can have opening government winning, closing opposition second, closing government third, opening opposition fourth, or any possible combination. So what you need to do at the end of the debate to make sure that all teams get a fair treatment is, firstly, ask yourself, which side convinced me? Which side of the motion do I agree with the most right now? Is it proposition or is it opposition? Usually you'll have an intuitive sense of which side you think had a particularly powerful argument that made you change your mind about something or just made it seem more appealing. Once you have worked out what side that is, ask yourself, what is the specific argument that you found was the strongest and the one that made you think that that's the side that won? And then you want to find the team that gave that argument. That is the team that likely takes the first. You now need to double check, did they actually prove that argument, or are you being biased? Was that argument rebutted in ways that you're ignoring? But if those things are not true and you think that argument has actually been proven, then that's probably the team that you have first. To work out the rest of the positions, discount that team and discount all of their contributions from the debates. Now, what side do you agree with the most? Do you agree the most still with, say, proposition, or have you now changed your mind? And then you do the same process. You work out what argument is it that made you change your mind, work out what team gave that argument, double check they actually gave that argument, double check that it wasn't refuted or taken down by any other team, and now you have the team that came second. And then you can repeat that for third and fourth, and then you have a ranking. So if you're struggling in terms of deciding which team has won the debate, as a very basic piece of advice, that's a process that works for me to make sure that I reach a good call sufficiently early in the debates. So I hope that makes sense in terms of basics. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in terms of mistakes that people usually make when judging. As before, if you have any questions, please just put it on the live chat and I will answer them as soon as I see them. So I'll go through the 5 mistakes or 5 rules in order. Rule number 1 is that judging is based on arguments. And this is something that I notice. All of these, by the way, are mistakes that I notice even at very high levels of judging and at very high levels of debating, in that there will be some of the best debaters in the world, maybe don't have that much experience judging, so they will make these mistakes, or in particular, very often with good rooms and teams that are sneaky about the arguments that they're giving not being fully proven. It's very easy to make these mistakes. So don't feel bad if you've made them, but they are mistakes that they happen at all levels. So rule number 1 that you need to remember is that judging is based on arguments, not reputation, not confidence, but also not things like style, like structure, or anything like that. So those things are things that may add to the argument, that they may enhance the argument and make it seem more persuasive, but nothing more. So the way that we judge debating in British parliamentary is whoever you think logically wins, whichever arguments beat other arguments, that's the team that's winning the debate. Essentially, if you start crediting style separately or structure separately in an otherwise close call, and say, for instance, well, opening government did give the same argument that closing government then repeated, but closing government had better structure, then you're essentially double rewarding them. Because whenever we decide whether an argument is compelling or not, style can already have a little bit of an influence there. Like, for example, in making an argument seem important, in trying to make an argument seem true, but we don't credit it separately from whether it strengthens the logic or not. In other words, an absolutely stupid idea, said with very pretty words, contributes absolutely 0 to a team winning the debate. It's only insofar as there's a logical idea that's presented, perhaps style or certain choices of words can make that come across better to you. But we never credit that separately. You would never justify a decision because the team had better structure or better style, or definitely not a better reputation. But this also means you need to remember to keep a clean slate. So it would be unfair if for any motion it was far easier for teams on one side to win than on the other side because of any personal bias or preconception you might have. So we ask you to please don't insert any special knowledge, don't insert any rebuttal that isn't obvious, and don't insert things like what you would have run instead. So I've seen a lot of judges be negatively predisposed to an argument because they've been in that debate before and they ran a different line, or maybe they even ran that line and lost. But we need to judge the debate that actually happens, not the debate that we wanted to happen. And we need to judge the debate that happens, not the debate that we would have had or we would have wanted to have instead. So never justify a call by saying things like, you know, I don't think this argument is good. I think this other argument is better, and that's what you should have run. You just want to look at what the teams tell you. This also means that you shouldn't insert any information that you think the average informed voter wouldn't know. So when judging, we usually try to imagine that we're a globally informed citizen, which is someone that maybe reads the newspaper once a week, is aware of world events, is aware of Trump and some of the things he's done, but isn't aware of specific details that wouldn't appear on the headlines or occasionally from skimming The Economist. So if you happen to have that specialist knowledge and a team lies about it, unless that team is called out and there's some justification either way, then please don't discredit that argument or add credit to that argument based on knowledge that you have. Essentially, facts have to be justified, and teams shouldn't win because they happen to also do a PhD in physics while you do a PhD in physics. So they're positively favored, whereas other teams might be negatively favored. So essentially, what this comes down to is, don't look at style or structure, just look at the logic in the argument. Keep a clean slate. Don't insert special knowledge. Don't undermine an argument because you can think of clever responses to it. 3, this also means you shouldn't complete the team's arguments. So you shouldn't, if they start on a good argument, they have a brilliant headline, don't finish that argument for them. Don't credit them as though it were complete if it isn't actually complete. I see that very often. And lastly, don't judge based on what arguments you would have run. And don't give feedback based on what arguments you would have run. It's usually quite unhelpful. If teams ask you, that's one thing. But otherwise saying things like, yeah, you were never going to lose with that argument, here's what you should have said instead, actually doesn't help anybody develop because you're not understanding what they were thinking and why they made the decisions that they made at the time. So that's point number 1. Judging is based on arguments. If you guys have any questions, then please type it down. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep going. So point number 2, pay attention to how arguments develop. This is, again, a mistake that I see being made by even some of the best judges in Europe and in the world. Do not judge based on the number of arguments that are presented. For example, if opening opposition puts one argument on the table, let's say that's the motion is going to harm the developing world, and closing opposition adds 3 arguments to the table, I don't know what those might be. Potential impact on women, potential impact on the economy, potential impact on democratic buy-in. The temptation by a lot of judges is to say that closing opposition beats opening opposition because they had more arguments. And I can understand where this comes from because it feels like they therefore have proven more things and they have more material on the table. But there's 2 things to bear in mind here. Firstly, not all arguments are equal. Some of them are much better proven than others. Some of them have a lot of logic and detail that makes that argument seem more probable, and therefore perhaps having one incredibly solid argument will count much more than having 3 arguments that are quite uncertain. Maybe they're rebutted quite well, maybe they're a bit exaggerated, or maybe they're just asserted. Like you've just said it's going to have an impact on women, but provided relatively little explanation as to why, whereas maybe opening opposition's argument on how it harms the developing world had a lot of logical links in it, and therefore it's much more concretely and strongly proven. But secondly, not all arguments are equal in terms of impacts. It's possible that the argument from opening opposition affects many more people and has much more grounding in the debate than 3 relatively irrelevant arguments from closing opposition. So it's never enough to say, well, you had 2 arguments, they had 1 argument, therefore you win. Or you had 2 arguments, they rebutted one of your arguments, but you had another argument left, whereas you rebutted their arguments, so they have 2 arguments left, and therefore you win. It's never that simple mathematics. You need to actually think carefully. Has this really been proven? And how much does it matter? How relevant is it to the round? Which leads into the second thing. Do not compare different impacts against each other, different consequences, different arguments, without assessing if speakers have actually proven what they have said. Very often I see judges being too happy to credit teams for an argument, even if the logical links are not actually there, even if the headline of the argument is a huge exaggeration, like this motion will lead to World War III, and then you're comparing an impact of World War III against other much more reasonable comparisons and outcomes from the other teams. So don't take the argument by its cover, just like a book by its cover. Look at what it's actually been proven, not at what they said they were going to prove, and then use that to compare it to the other teams. So you need to assess the quality of an explanation, not assume that they have proven it. So therefore, what you want to do is to look out for assertions, look out for logical leaps, look out for things that they assume to be true but are not necessarily true. And if there's a lot of those gaps, then perhaps you won't be convinced of that argument as much as you would have been if they had provided that explanation. Thirdly, this also means you need to keep track of rebuttal. And again, what I think differentiates the best judges is their ability to track a debate, to take a lot of notes, and to be able to follow how an argument develops throughout the round. It takes practice, but it's very important to always try to do it. So if there's rebuttal to an argument, ask yourself, is this enough to take it down? Is this enough to mitigate it and to reduce the impact that it's going to have? Or is it just enough to shed doubt, to make me believe, okay, it might not happen, but it might still be quite bad if it happens. So rebuttal can do a lot of different things. Ask yourself, what is it doing in this instance? And then try to track if the next speaker reconstructs that argument and fixes it so that that rebuttal no longer works. Essentially, don't credit the team for their argument as it's presented. Credit them in comparison with each team based on how much those teams respond to those arguments, and make sure that you do keep track of that rebuttal, because there may be nothing standing, but there may be a little bit standing that you still need to factor in. And lastly, yes, it's actually what I just said. So you need to assess whether the rebuttal takes the point down or only makes it smaller. Very often rebuttal doesn't entirely disprove something, but it can be enough to suggest that an argument is less likely or less impactful. So you need to pay attention to how these things develop throughout the debate. And whenever you're doing any comparison, therefore, you're going to have to be quite detailed to make sure that people understand how that argument developed throughout the debate and how things played out. So that's point number 2, which is that you need to pay attention to how arguments develop. I'm going to move on to number 3. Again, if anybody has questions, now's a good time to type them up. So I'm going to move on to number 3, which is that judging is comparative, which is something that maybe is obvious, but I think people don't realize just how important it is. So as I said before, there can be any possible combination between the 4 teams in the round. So as a judge, you need to be prepared to justify how teams place in the debate in relation to every other team. It's never enough to say, well, you were very clever, so you win, whereas the other 3 teams were disagreeing about something different and describe those 2 things separately. All teams have to be compared to each other. So the way that you should be judging is something that I find very useful, is you should start comparing teams throughout the debate. At the very start is when you should already be thinking about what the call is going to be and the result is going to be. You don't want to wait until the end, because if you wait until the end of the debate and those 15 minutes of judging time to decide your call, that's going to be too late. You're not going to have enough time in 2 minutes to gather your thoughts and come to a full call. So from the start of the debate, ask yourself, who's winning right now? What I usually do is, after you've had 1 speech from opening government and 1 speech from opening opposition, I ask myself, okay, who's winning now? What were the contributions from one? What were the contributions from another? Was there a rebuttal? Is that enough to take it over? Then Deputy Prime Minister, the second speaker from opening government, also goes up to speak, and I ask myself, okay, is that enough for OG to beat OO? And then the second speaker from OO goes up to speak, and then I ask myself, okay, the top half is over, so OG and OO are done speaking. I now need to have a decision about which team is winning. And after this point, I should not change my mind. They should be done, and I should be able to park that decision away. So ask yourself right now, which team had the best contributions? How does the rebuttal compare? How do the arguments compare to each other? And then make that decision. Then closing government goes up to speak, and you should do the same thing and bring them into the mix and say, so far, have they beaten opening government? No, they haven't. Okay, they need more work. So far, have they beaten opening opposition? Yes, they have. Excellent. And then closing up comes in, and then CT finishes and CO finishes. And essentially, by the end of the debate, you should already have the the skeleton of a call. And then you have 2 minutes to look over your notes and double check that that's the correct call and make sure that you haven't missed anything. But you shouldn't have to start working on a call from scratch at that point. So that's what I would say. Make sure that you're comparing teams throughout the debates. Second thing that I would say is make sure that you need to be very specific in your comparisons. Very often judges are comparing teams by saying things that are fairly generic, such as their arguments were good, or they were less convincing, or their analysis got better in second opposition. Also, guys, I think that the camera and also the microphone has gone back on for you guys, so there's a little bit of echo. If you want to just turn it back off. It's up to you, I don't mind, I just thought I'd let you know. So anyway, you need to be very specific in the comparisons. It's not enough to say things like, OG was good, but CO was better, or OG was good, but CG had better analysis or better explanations, or they were more specific. You need to be able to pick out individual sentences, individual points of analysis or points of rebuttal that teams are adding, and make sure you're comparing those to each other. The reason for that is that the more vague you are, the easier it is to justify any kind of random call, right? It's very easy to say things like, you lacked rebuttal, or it was unclear what you meant, or you weren't very comparative. And that doesn't help the teams and it doesn't hold you accountable. So good judging looks more like saying, so we had this one argument from opening government, although we were concerned about whether this link was true or not, it wasn't pointed out in the debate. So we were convinced that this impact would happen at least sometimes and seemed important. However, from opening opposition, these 2 lines of rebuttal undermine it because they make us think that A, it's not going to happen, and B, is not important. And by contrast, we have this other argument from opening opposition about the principled obligation to prioritize this group of people instead. Opening government never engages with that. So therefore, opening opposition takes it over opening government. So that's the kind of way that you want to phrase a comparison, right? Or you might say things like, opening opposition give us these 2 arguments about the impact on children and women. Comparing that to closing opposition, we think the first argument is quite repetitive of what they said, but we think there's a second very interesting argument about the developing world. We discussed for a while which one was more important, and we thought that from closing opposition, there were 3 pieces of analysis that justified why that one mattered more. Firstly, they tell us that it affects more people. Secondly, they tell us that they're more vulnerable. And thirdly, they tell us that children and women, actually the impact on them is quite uncertain because of this and that reason. So therefore, we thought that the material contribution from closing opposition was more thorough and slightly better justified in its importance than the material from opening opposition. I hope that makes sense. That's at least how I like to make comparisons within the teams. But as I said, you need to refer to arguments and rebuttal that were made, not to general impressions that you got from one team or the other. The third thing to bear in mind here is that, as I said at the start, you need to compare teams with all other teams in the debate. This is true in your head throughout the debate, in the 15 minutes of adjudication if possible, but definitely when you're explaining the results to the teams. You don't want to say, here's why you take the first, here's why you take the second underneath the first, here's why you take the third underneath the second, and here's why you take the fourth underneath the third. If possible, you need to compare all teams to all other teams. So you might say, here's why opening government wins. From opening opposition, you place under OG for this reason, you place over CG for this reason, you place over CO for this reason. Closing government, here's why you place in relation to the others. Because otherwise you might be very lazy in some comparisons. And for example, there may be a team that is very strongly rebutted by another team, and that may make you think that they take the fourth. But actually, if you inspect it more closely, there's 0 rebuttal from another team. And maybe they have a very good point of information to a different team. So they're not necessarily taking a fourth, and you need to take time to make sure you're checking all of the comparisons and that everything makes sense. And the last thing to bear in mind here is also a really important one, which is you need to be fair to the teams, and you need to let them tell you what argument or what metric is the most important one in the debate. So good judges try not to interfere in the debates in any way, and they try not to bring in their personal biases or personal leanings into the debate. So try as much as possible to not decide that different stakeholders or different kinds of arguments, like principal arguments or practical arguments, are more important one than the other. The teams should be telling you that. The team should be telling you, here's why my argument matters more than the argument from the other teams. And if they don't do that, please don't insert preferences, and please don't decide that a practical argument matters more because it concretely affects people, or that the developing world matters more, or that the developed world matters more, or children matter more, or women matter more, or whatever it is. Let the teams tell you which arguments matter more, and let the teams fight it out on that metric. You can have the first argument, which is why children matter more, and you can have a first argument on the other side that says why the developing world matters more than children. But essentially, that is part of the debate, and the teams should contest it, and you shouldn't have a bias one way or the other. So if you spot yourself having a bias, then please try to correct for it. So that's it in terms of point 3, which is that you need to be comparative. I'll pause for questions and for a sip of water and coffee, and then I'll move on to point 4. So, starting on point 4 then. Unless, or was there a question?
Yeah, okay. Okay.
No?
Okay. Yeah, we have a question. Sorry. What do you do when teams either don't do it, when they don't do the comparative by themselves, or when some of them do, others don't? How do you pick them?
Okay, good question. So, firstly, if one team justifies why their argument matters and another team doesn't do that, then it's likely that the team that justified why their argument matters is likely to win the debate. That is entirely contingent on whether they actually prove the thing that they have said matters, right? So very often I see teams saying, what matters the most in this debate is world peace, or what matters the most in this debate is ending, for instance, the Israel-Palestine conflict. We're going to be the team that does that. But unfortunately, they don't have the analysis to back it up because it's a very difficult thing to actually prove. But if a team manages to prove something, and they give you a reason to believe that it's more important than the other arguments in the debate, that's a legitimate reason to put them ahead. Similarly, if the teams both do it, but they don't engage to each other. So for example, one team says, we're going to help women. Here is why women matter. And then another team says, no, we're going to help the economy. Here is why the economy matters. Then you need to assess which of those arguments was better developed and which of those justifications for which argument matters more was better developed, right? Again, you can't rely on teams saying that they've proven the impact or proven that this is the most important argument in the round. You need to actually check whether they have actually proven it's the most important point in the round. But if they've done that, then you can make that comparison. And lastly, what happens if the teams don't do it at all, which happens often? In that case, there's two things that usually happen. Firstly, you have now two metrics for the debate. You now need to see who's winning on the women point, and you need to see who's winning on the economy point. And if a team has engaged a lot on the clash of the other side, then perhaps they're ahead, as well as winning on their clash. Whereas if another team is winning on both clashes, then maybe that team is ahead. So perhaps you don't even need to resolve the metric question in that specific instance, if that makes sense. But in this scenario where nobody tells you what argument is important, and you're forced to treat all arguments as being roughly equal, sometimes there are minimal intuitions that you can rely on, right? If someone says, this motion will lead to war, and another motion says, and another team says, this motion will make, will like reduce unemployment, then it is safe for you, for example, in that case, to intervene the smallest possible amount and say, I think people would agree that war matters more than unemployment, so I therefore found this more impactful. But the thing is, you want to minimize how much you ever have to do that. And anytime you do that, you need to be able to justify it to the teams, because there's nothing more frustrating than when a judge comes over and is like, oh, well, actually, I was bullied in school, so I find bullying to be a really big harm compared to educational achievement. So I credited that argument more, right? Subjective things like that, please try to avoid it at all costs. If you can't justify why you found an argument more important to the teams, then it's illegitimate and you're inserting things. So be careful with that. And sometimes if there's no metric at all, then you just look at what was the most solidly proven, what had the most reasoning behind it, what is the argument that was proven with most certainty to you. As I said before, some arguments will just have one line of reasoning behind them. Some arguments will have like 4 or 5 strands of analysis showing why something is likely and the impact it has on different groups. So usually, even if there's no metric, you can determine which argument was more important. So that's what I would say in answer to that question. Anything else? No, we good? Okay, great. So moving on to point number 4, which is the role on the table. So as I said at the start, in debating, we try to only look at the arguments that have been provided. When making the call, we try not to factor in things like structure or style. We just want to focus on the logic and test which teams are better at doing analysis. However, there's one restriction to this, which is the role on the table. And there are some rules that we need to factor into debating to make sure that it's fair and that teams are only contributing what they're allowed to contribute and nothing more, and to make sure that the debate is good for all teams. So in terms of role fulfillment, there's a couple of things that we bear in mind. Thing one, well, actually, let's go position by position. So with opening government, they have an expectation to define the problem, and they have an expectation to explain the problem that exists and to set out a clear mechanism by how the motion is going to resolve this problem. So there has to be some kind of argument from opening government explaining why it's good to do the motion, perhaps why it's going to work to do the motion, and why it's better than the alternative. That is a good OG. That is not to say that if OG doesn't outline a problem, then they take an automatic fourth or anything like that. I'll discuss that in more detail later. But it does mean that a case from opening government in which they only outline a problem but they don't outline a solution is very unlikely to have anything relevant to the debate if they're not providing that solution. That's sort of an incomplete case. From opening opposition, you expect them to defend the status quo or to counter-propose another policy. They can do either. It should be mutually exclusive with the policy from opening government, and there should be some explanation or assumption of why it is better. So either then they would have to do rebuttal on why there is no problem, the solution will not work, or the solution is going to create more problems. But usually you'd expect them to have some kind of stance. So these are not things that you would penalize if they don't happen, but these are the expectations you would have on teams. From OG, you outline a problem, a solution, and explain why it's better than the alternatives. From OO, you either contest that that's a problem, suggest that there's better ways of fixing it, that this is going to lead to more harms. In terms of the role on the table, therefore, the debate can become quite a mess if teams are not doing that. And you can, for example, discount some of the material from opening opposition if they don't explain what counter policy they might have. So something that I think happens very often is an opening opposition. This isn't to say you didn't say what you defended, so therefore you take a fourth. But this is to say very often opening opposition teams stand up and say, oh, you want to ban alcohol to reduce I don't know, like car accidents, but there's loads of other ways to do it that don't involve banning alcohol, so we don't see why you need to do this. And then they just move on. And I just think it's worth pointing out that isn't really enough as a counter proposal, because you're not defending what policy you would have instead. So just like from opening government, the role is to have a policy. From opening opposition, you should also say, if you're defending the status quo, that's grand. But if you're not defending the status quo and you have a different policy, you need to defend that from the outset, and you need to say what that policy is going to be. It's not acceptable, for example, for closing opposition to stand up and have a new policy, right? Bringing in closing teams, closing government and closing opposition, you have the interesting thing with extension and summary teams, right? So from extension, you should be bringing new things. This may be new arguments. This may be more analysis on the same arguments. This may be substantial rebuttal to opening teams. Or this may just be like logical framing, right? To explain why one argument matters more than another, for instance. So all of these things can count as an extension. It's essentially taking something that has previously not been sufficiently developed and developing it with some new analysis or new mechanisms, or even potentially new examples or new contexts. You should also avoid contradicting your own bench when you're in extension. And anything that you say that follows from a direct knife or a direct contradiction is going to be ignored. In summary, you should not be adding new arguments, especially in opposition whip. There's zero sympathy for that, and you should be summarizing the debate. But just because you're not allowed to add new arguments doesn't mean you can't add anything, right? And I think as judges, it's important to be very clear on the distinction. Because of summary, you can still add a lot of new rebuttal, a lot of new framing, a lot of new examples and new contexts, and you can even develop the arguments that have already been presented. You can't add any completely new arguments, but if your partner made an argument and that argument was attacked, in summary, you can stand up and rebuild and reconstruct that argument to explain why that rebuttal doesn't work. So the reason that I'm going through all of this, obviously you all know that because you've been debating, but it's really important as judges to be aware of what you can credit and what you cannot credit in extension and in summary. So too often I see judges that disregard an extension because it was rebuttal. When rebuttal can be a perfectly valid extension, there's actually no intrinsic difference between rebuttal and substantive. Like you could frame your rebuttal with the title and then suddenly it becomes substantive. And similarly, I see judges being either unwilling to credit any development from summary, which is absurd because obviously you're meant to be moving the case forward. And I also see summary speakers that are trying to introduce completely new ideas, which is not acceptable because teams don't have a chance to respond to it. So please make sure that whenever you're judging, you factor in role fulfillment and you check that teams are following the rules and that they are not introducing arguments that they should not be allowed to introduce, but also that you're not ignoring arguments that they're perfectly legitimate in introducing. However, caveat to this is that role fulfillment should not take priority over argument strength, but it helps make the debate fair and it helps you discount things that you need to discount. Which brings me to point number 5, which I'm just going to go straight into. And if you have questions, we can take them after, which is discounting, not punishing. So anytime that people make mistakes in debating, so whether that is introducing new material from summary, contradicting their opening half, assertions or contradictions even within their own speech, having bad time management or bad structure, or having like a very short speech, those are never things that lead to you punishing a team. For instance, these are never things that lead to an automatic fourth for the simple reason that there may be another team that does it. And now you have two automatic fourths, which is impossible. So anytime that people are making these mistakes, you don't do negative marking, right? You don't do, you made 3 mistakes, so therefore minus 10, I don't know, like winning points. We use positive marking, so you reward teams for any good analysis they have or good rebuttal they have. Anything they do that is against the rules, you just ignore it, right? You just ignore any arguments that depends on a premise that was a fundamental contradiction with their opening half. You ignore anything that follows from a contradiction on a previous argument they've justified. You ignore new material that comes in summary. If there's things like bad teamwork or bad structure, that's a shame, but they don't get minus points for it, if that makes sense. So that is it in terms of the main rules of judging. I wanted to chat a little bit as well about taking notes, sharing and feedback, and also very quickly about speaker points. But before that, are there any other questions or anything else that you guys want me to talk about? Even if it's completely off point, like how do you make a principal argument or whatever, I can answer any question you guys have.
Okay, there's a question here in the room. What about knifing? Do you still disregard it, or there's another set of rules that apply?
Yeah, so if there's knifing, which is to say when you contradict something that has been said before, the same thing that I just said applies. You don't punish a team for it, right? You don't penalize them for, I don't know, like bad sportsmanship or for contradicting their opening half or something. You don't take like minus points because of it. However, any argument that follows from that contradiction is ignored. The reason for that is that opening opposition, for instance, can't be expected to respond to 2 lines of argument that are mutually exclusive with each other and directly contradictory. So if opening government says, we're going to implement this policy, we think it's going to lead to a lot of instability in the Middle East, and we think that's good because it will lead to revolution. Closing government shouldn't stand up and say, no, we think this will lead to stability in the Middle East, and we think that's good because it's going to lead to better quality of life. Because opening opposition can't expect that closing government are going to say something completely contradictory, so they can't prepare for it and they can't respond for it. So if you say something that follows from a contradiction, as a judge, you should ignore it, insofar as it depends on that contradiction, right? Very often, actually, teams decide to knife for some reason because they weren't paying attention to their top half or something, but they still have very good parts of the argument that happen even if you accept what their opening half team and don't actually rely on that contradiction at all. So make sure that you check this. Having said that, it's important also to know the difference between a knife and an even if, right? Like there's a lot of things that may sound like a knife, but actually are not necessary contradictions. There may be things like opening government said that something is going to happen sometimes, or opening government said that something is going to happen. And you said, yes, that is true, that will happen sometimes, but here is something else that could happen instead. That's absolutely fine. That's not a contradiction. It minimizes the importance of the opening team a little bit, but that's fine. That's what you're meant to do. You're meant to be beating them as well. So you can say that their arguments are true, but less relevant than yours. Or you might say things like, we agree with opening government that this will lead to instability, But we're also going to take opening opposition at their best and say, even if it leads to stability, why do we think that can still be positive in those instances, right? So you can frame material that can't exist at the same time as a sort of safety net, extra layer of defense against the opposition, and say, we agree with them. We have a slightly different premise where we're also going to win. So even if opposition is right, then we have material that still stands in the debate. So those things are not nice. They're not contradictions. You can still credit them. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay, cool. Well, I'll hop on. And if you guys have any other questions, then feel free to type them whenever you want. So very quickly on notes, sharing, and feedback. Taking notes is quite important when you're a judge, and it may be useful to have a system. You guys can have whatever system you work, but I can share with you the one that works well for me. I would recommend that you guys take clear and as detailed notes as possible so that you can refer to them in adjudication, because it can be quite frustrating when judges are unable to quote exact arguments, and it can be quite nice when judges are able to quote exact lines of argument that you gave. And that's what you should be doing. You shouldn't be rephrasing teams' arguments in your own words. You should, as much as possible, use the words they give you, use the arguments they give you. When you're taking notes, I recommend that you use 2 or 3 colors, one for your notes of the flow, so what the speeches actually say, one for feedback or criticism or gaping holes, and maybe one different one for rebuttal. But I think those things, or for points of information, you can do it however way you want, but you want to make those things distinguishable for each other. For example, when I'm taking notes, I'll use black for the main bulk of stuff, and then I'll use blue for both POIs and for any feedback that I want to give them. So therefore, if teams come over to me later for individual feedback, I can look at my notes for their speech and just go in order through all of the comments in blue that I wrote and say, yes, you were not clear at this point in your speech. This argument, I didn't understand what you were saying. This argument didn't have an impact, right? Hopefully more constructive things like this. But I might write things like, why is this true? Or like examples or impact to remind myself, what do I think is wrong with this argument? I'd recommend that you guys draw arrows for rebuttal or for clashes. Draw arrows and a question mark for missing rebuttal to show there was meant to be a response there and it isn't there, so you can remind yourself later. And if you want to make notes on things like structure or style or timing, you can do it for individual feedback purposes, but I wouldn't recommend at least referencing it in your oral adjudication. Like, give it to teams as personal feedback later, but it shouldn't be part of the call. And you don't want to waste time in the oral adjudication saying things that are not part of the call because teams might think that they were. So in terms of notes, this is how I do it. I hope you can see. I have 3 pieces of paper, 2 of which I use for tracking the details of the debates and the details of the speeches. There are these ones, which I've called top half and bottom half. It might be back to front, but hopefully it sort of makes sense. And this is where I divide the paper into 4, and I just write down quite detailed. Point 1, here's the analysis, here's the subpoints, here's the impact, here's the comparison, here's the rebuttal. Do the same thing for opening opposition, right? And it looks something like this, maybe, but more detailed. I hope that makes sense. So I do that for the top half, then I do the same thing for bottom half. And that is where the main details of the speech go and the main personal feedback that I have go. However, when I'm actually in the 15 minutes of trying to work out the call of the debate afterwards with a panel, and when I'm giving the feedback to the teams, I don't use those papers. I use a 3rd piece of paper, which is my master sheet, which looks like this. And it's much more simple and much more minimalistic. What I do is I draw a cross in the middle of the paper, and I just write down literally just headlines. Headlines of arguments, headlines of rebuttal, just the most important summary of contributions from each team. And I add to this throughout the debate. Like at the end of every speech, I'll go back to this and I'll say, okay, great. There was point 1, which was women. Point 2, which was children. There was a very good piece of rebuttal. The squiggly arrow thing is how I write down rebuttal. And it looks maybe something like this. The reason that I do that is because, firstly, when you're giving feedback, you don't want to look at your very detailed notes because it's a mess and you're going to get lost and confused. And there's a lot of details that are more or less relevant to the call. So you want to have a neat version. And you also want to be able to clearly distinguish what the contributions of each team were. So I find it very useful to be able to say, from Moji, we get 2 main ideas. Firstly, on children, secondly, on the principle. The first argument is rebutted by OO in this way, but I don't think that's successful. The second argument isn't rebutted, so I think it stands, although I do have this question about it. So that's your contribution, comparing with OO, etc., etc. And it's also very useful when you're comparing opening teams to their closing teams, right? So as I said before, in terms of role fulfillment, a closing half team needs to have an extension. They need to have something that is new. But it's not enough for it to be new. It also has to be better, right? So you need to check, are the arguments from closing government actually just the same as the arguments from opening government? And then are they better? Are they better proven, and are they more important? So when you have this here, you can tell, oh, hang on, the headlines are the same. Let me look at the analysis and see if they actually added anything new. And it can be quite useful just as a check. So that's what I use. And again, I add comments in blue with the main reasons that I thought one comparison went one way or the other. But that's what works for me. Do whatever works for you, but that helps me quite a lot. And lastly, in terms of chairing and feedback, as I said at the start, I'll just do a quick recap. The role of chairs and wings is different. The role of chairs is to ask questions, and the role of wings is to answer questions as much as possible. In the adjudication, in those 15 minutes, as the chair, you should get everyone's calls, try to structure the discussion one comparison at a time. Make sure that everybody has to say, take notes of the discussion from the wings, and take notes of the reasons why you think one team is beating another team. And you need to make sure that teams or comparisons are all given some discussion. So you want to spend longer on the teams that, on the comparisons that you disagreed the most on, but you need to discuss all comparisons. You can't go, great, we all agree that this team wins, let's move on. At least you need to spend like 15 seconds on, do we agree for the same reasons? Great, let's move on. Then when you give feedback, make sure that all teams are getting equal time. You can either structure it by comparisons or do it chronologically. You should use the notes from the adjudication chat, including what the wing said, and you need to explain all clashes and all comparisons, as I said before. I'll say just one final thing here, and then if you guys have like specific questions, we'll go through that, which is, all of this is about the technical stuff, right? Like rules and principles you need to follow, things you're allowed to credit, things you're not allowed to credit, how you should approach judging. It can get quite complicated. There's one thing that I follow as a principle that I think is the thing that has helped me feel comfortable in nearly every call that I give, which is I always try to step into the shoes of the teams, and I try to treat arguments with as much respect as possible. That is to say, if you're able to explain the results to a team in a way that signals that you understand where they were going with that argument, even if you don't think it was fully proven, that team is going to be so much more receptive, right? Saying things like, and then we get some stuff about the developing world. To be honest, I didn't understand this argument. So you take a fourth. It's your job to convince me, and I wasn't convinced, is likely to piss off some teams and make them feel like you were just not even listening to their speech. Whereas if you say something like, so here, what I think you guys are trying to go for is an argument about the developing world trying to change the context to show that here's a completely new context where the impacts are so much bigger and people are more vulnerable. The problem is, for that to make sense, I need you to explain why that context matters more, and I need you to provide any new analysis. Unfortunately, you give me these two reasons, and I'm not entirely sure how it works. I assume it's something like this, but I'm filling in the analysis for you now. You would have had to say this in your speech. And this other part is a little bit too similar to opening government when they tell me that. So unfortunately, I couldn't credit it, and I would recommend that you spend a little bit more time asking yourself why this is true in the future in your speeches, right? That kind of explanation makes teams feel like it wasn't that you weren't listening, it's that they didn't say the things that they thought that they had said. And the more that you approach judging that way, the better it's going to go, and the happier that everyone is going to be, is a piece of advice that I would give. So that was me going through the rules and principles of judging. You guys may well have a lot of questions on different stuff that I haven't spoken about, like close calls or managing a panel, or I don't know, like anything else about debating. So if you guys want to tell me any questions now, then we can chat about it for a little bit. And then whenever there's no more questions, we can call it off. We can also, as I said, chat about not judging, something else about debating, or whatever you want. I'll wait, it's okay.
So I think there's a question in YouTube. Maybe you can check that out. I think Hugo is writing it. Also, how do you give feedback? You pick the teams in chronological order? Do you choose the last first?
Okay, so there's two main ways that you can do it. You can either go in chronological order. So say, here's what we get from OG, here's what you get from OO, how does it compare to OG? Here's what we get from CG, how does it compare to OG and OO? And then the same for CO. Or you can do it first to fourth, essentially. I prefer to do it in chronological order because then I have a standard way of giving feedback that I know is going to be the same at the start of the debate. So I don't need to make any last minute weird decisions depending on any last minute changes in calls. And also, I think that it's the best way to make sure you're actually comparing all teams. Because otherwise, if you start with first and second, and then second and third and fourth, it's very likely that you will only discuss first and second and third and fourth, and not spend as much time on first compared to fourth. So what works for me is doing it chronologically, but you can practice with a couple and see what works best for you. And in terms of how I structure the feedback, I mean, I've sort of hinted at it throughout, which is I will reference the main contributions we get from a team. I will explain what happens with those arguments and if there's attempted rebuttal to them, if I think that's successful or not. And then I compare them to whatever other team I'm discussing. And I might also have some general comments like, and then to discuss closing government. So the general approach from closing government, which I think is a very good one, is they add a new framing to the debate. Given that the top half has been quite messy in discussing the principle of the debate, whether it's one way or the other, I think they very effectively move away from that debate and say, that can't be resolved, here's a new practical impact. So I think that's one good way they differentiate themselves. And the way they do that in their arguments is through point 1 and point 2. So you can have a general comment like that, but essentially the format I follow is this team, contributions, did they stand? How does it compare to other teams? And then you do that all the way down. That's usually what works for me. You might also have general pieces of feedback for everybody that you want to give at the start before you give them the call or after you give them the call. That's fine, and it can be really useful, but you need to keep it brief. That's sort of doing coaching instead of judging, right? Things like everyone needs to do more rebuttal, or actually, fun fact about Venezuela that would have changed the debate if you guys had known it. Those things can be interesting, but again, you need to make sure that the teams are put out of their misery, and you need to give them the call soon, because otherwise they will get stressed. And secondly, if you're going to tell them facts, you need to make it really clear that that was not part of the decision of the call and that you didn't give them the fourth because they didn't know that fact. If you can do those things, then that stuff can be useful as well. So there's another question, which is how to handle tough panels in semifinals and finals, as in time-wise, in case people are not willing to change their positions and not rush to a vote that makes them feel antagonized. So judging in, first thing to say, judging in semifinals and finals is different. So if you guys are just wondering about judging for in rounds at a tournament, like most rounds in a tournament, ignore everything that follows because there's two very different processes. For starters, in semifinals and finals, you usually don't come to a complete call because it would take a little bit too long to do so. You just come to, and you have longer panels, so it would be literally impossible. So in a final, you want to decide the winner. In semifinals, you want to decide two teams that go through, two teams that do not go through. So firstly, you need to structure it in a clever way. The way that I do it is, in semifinals, I ask everybody to take like 2 or 3 minutes, like always, and try to come up with a team they think is definitely in, a team they think is definitely out, and then they can give me a full call if possible, if they want to, or they can say, these two teams are definitely in and these two teams are definitely out. That's all right. But it's useful for them to tell you what are they certain about and what do they want to have a chat about. So very often the answers will be something like, I think OO is definitely in, I think CO is definitely out, and I want to have a chat about whether OG or CG are going through. And then you'll have, I don't know, like maybe 5 potential calls in front of you. You need to work out where is the agreement, where's the disagreement, and you need to start on that. For example, and firstly, just because you don't need to come to a full call, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be comparative, right? You still need to never discuss a team's arguments in isolation because that doesn't make sense because no team is proving anything perfectly. So you need to say, okay, great. So most people seem to think that CO is definitely out. Let's compare them to the other teams and double check that no team is beating them, or that all teams are beating them. And if you can find at least 2 teams that are beating closing opposition for a semifinal, then they're out because you need to beat 2 teams to be able to make it through a semifinal. And then you move on to the next least popular one, or you move on to wherever you think the biggest discussion is going to be. So usually that's a way to structure the discussion. Start with the easy ones and then spend longest on the disagreement, which is a little bit unusual compared to normal panels. But as I said, it's because it's a slightly different kind of call and usually slightly different time dynamics. 2 things that I would recommend. Firstly, give yourself a time limit. Either it may be imposed by the schedule or it may be imposed just by yourself because you can't let it go on forever. Tell those teams that time limit at the start. You may need to break it if you're really close to coming to a decision, but I think it's always useful to say, let's aim to get this done in half an hour, but I'm going to set 40 minutes as the maximum at which time we will call a vote. And then you can refer to that if people are being really stubborn. Sometimes people just will not change their minds. That's fine. Usually in outrounds, judges are a bit better, so they're a little bit better at explaining why they think the way that they think. And between all of you, you should be able to unpack why someone thinks that. But the thing I would say is, usually when you have a really strong disagreement in a panel and someone that will not change their minds, if you, after discussing it for like 5 minutes, you're still at complete disagreements and you can't sort it out, then it's probably because of a fundamental difference in the reading of the debate. For instance, someone might have thought that an argument had a certain line of logic that someone else didn't credit, or like one piece of rebuttal that someone believes and someone doesn't believe, or maybe someone thinks that an argument is new and someone thinks that that argument isn't new. That's very likely to happen at some point in debating. So don't worry too much if it happens. But I think at that point it's worth recognizing, okay, we're not going to resolve this. You have some reasons to believe that you're not going to change your mind. You're not. At this point, we're not progressing. We're going in circles and no new ideas are going introduced. We'll do like a final round to see if anyone has anything new to add to this comparison. And if not, we're calling a vote and we're moving on. And I think that's a strategy that I sometimes have had to use, which is, I understand everyone feels strongly, but we're repeating the same things and people are not changing their minds. So this is your last chance to add something new, and then we call a vote. And I think the most unpleasant judging, well, I don't want to say the most unpleasant, but the longest judging panel I've ever been on was a Euro semi-final in which we were judging for like nearly 3 hours, and it was miserable and everybody had left the venue. And it ended up that way because I think in part a hesitance to call a vote, secondly, a strange structuring of the discussion, and thirdly, the fact that there were a lot of non-transitive calls. So for example, depending on the order in which you voted, you would put 2 teams through or 2 other teams through because people thought that OG beats OO, which beats CO, which beats CG, which beats OG. So there was no perfect way to work it out. If that doesn't happen, though, it should be relatively easy to solve disagreements. Just put a time limit, prod people to give you new reasons. And if you can't, like, try to find the disagreement as soon as possible. Then prod people to justify the disagreement one way or the other. And once nothing new is coming out, you need to call a vote. That's the only way to do it. And in terms of structuring the discussion is start with the easy ones. Normally you will come to an agreement on where the meat of the discussion has to be, and then you can spend more time there, not having to worry about closing opposition because you've already put them out, or not having to worry about opening government because you've already secured their spot in the break and you're discussing who took the second. So there's another question I can see, which is, what is your advice to someone who's going to start debating for the first time? That's, what would I say as advice? Okay, so that's a very broad question. Main things that I would say is, firstly, ask yourself why. Very often you're going to find an argument and think that it's just obviously true, or you'll hit emotion and be like, how am I meant to oppose this? This is a great idea. I just need to defend human rights. Or, oh, this is going to be good for women. Very often the biggest mistake that I've seen novices make is all of the arguments need 1 or 2 explanations more. And I think the way that you can make sure that you're giving those explanations is, in preparation time, ask yourself why, or get your teammate to ask yourself a lot of why questions. So it doesn't have to literally be why, but it can be, why is this true? Can you give me an example? Has this happened before? How do we know people will act this way? Is this like any other policy? And I think those kinds of questions can help you work out what detail you need to add in the argument. And very often people will say things like, you need more analysis. What they mean is, you need to ask yourself why questions more. You need to provide justifications for more steps in that argument. And the second way that you can do this is, and I find this really effective, ask yourself how you would rebut your own argument. So pretend for a little while that you're opening opposition and you're rebutting yourself, or that you're closing opposition and you're asking yourself a really mean point of information. What is that point of information? What is that rebuttal? And then fix your argument so that that rebuttal doesn't work anymore. If you do this well, and it's a habit, it gets easier, you're always going to be several steps ahead of your opponents, because now they have this rebuttal planned and suddenly it doesn't work because you developed the argument so much that they need to do so much extra work to make it count. And then I'll say one last thing, which is in terms of the arguments that you choose to run, one last mistake that I definitely made a lot when I was a novice is I would ever panic, and I mean panic, if I felt like I didn't have enough arguments in a debate. Like I would get really nervous if I was opening government and I had only 1 argument, or I could only think of 2, and I couldn't find a way to to broaden it and to find more groups of people to talk about. That's absolutely fine if that happens. You just need to then spend longer on those arguments and make sure that you really prove it in detail, doing the steps that I said before, and then add an argument on why this thing that you've just proven is the most important one in the debate. That's doing something we call impacting or framing. And that is where, apart from saying this is good because it's going to help children, you then do one separate step of analysis when you say, and here is why children matter. Here is why children are really important, why we have obligations to help them. And therefore, yes, you only had one argument, but you've made that argument stick and you've convinced the judges that it's relevant. And that's often better than having, here's why it's good for children and for the environment and for the economy and principally and for politics. Because those are 5 arguments that you're probably not able to prove in full detail. And therefore, you might just be left with nothing if the judges didn't believe that any of them was sufficiently solid to be able to win the debate. So that's probably what I would say. Prioritize making sure your arguments are proven in a lot of detail. Have a lot of fun. And don't worry if you feel like you don't have enough arguments. Obviously, it's good if you have 5 or 6 brilliant ideas, but judges will only credit things if they're actually proven. So make sure that you slow down, ask yourself, what's the weakness of this argument, and then develop it so that that doesn't work anymore. If you have any more specific questions about debating, I'm happy to answer as well. Is there anything else at all? Any other questions? I think Diogo has disappeared. I can wait. I'll wait for another minute or so to see if there's any other questions. But if not, guys, if you can't think of any other questions now, then please feel free to send me a message whenever you want. As I said, my name is Olivia Sundberg. We've been running a lot of workshops with Portugal before, and it's really fun. So I'm always here if you guys ever want to have another workshop on any other topic or on judging again or anything like that. So just feel free to send me a message on Facebook if you think of any other questions afterwards. Otherwise, I think we might be done. So I might just end things here if that's okay with everyone. Oh, actually, there's one more question which just came now, which is, as a judge, how would you handle an equity breach during a debate? Okay, equity is a very interesting question. Normally, I think there's, to an extent, different things apply depending on the equity violation. But normally, as a judge, you don't want to let equity violations change the result of the debate. So basically, the principle as a judge for everything is non-intervention, right? You want, if there's a knife, you want to discount anything you need to discount because of the knife, but then allow the debate to go on as usual. If there is a squirrel, that is to say a definition that isn't fair, you want to, as much as possible, let the debaters just sort out their own debates and sort out their own metrics and arguments as much as possible. So your principle is, I'm just going to let the debate happen and not change anything that happens in it. And then based on what the team said themselves, I'm going to determine the call. And a little bit the same thing happens with equity violations. So we try to keep it as 2 separate processes. If there is an equity violation, you probably want to report it afterwards to the equity officer. But you want to judge the debate separately. Very often, ideas that are offensive are also not very persuasive because they're not likely to be rationally and logically explained, because then people wouldn't believe them. So if you have arguments like, oh, but women are really hormonal and terrible at making decisions, so therefore aren't they going to be really bad in I don't know, like, isn't this policy going to make women make bad decisions and like screw up the country? Then you probably don't find that a very compelling argument. You wouldn't give them minus points because it's an equity violation. You would just assess how persuasively and how plausibly has this been justified. And if there's no justification, then you might just treat that as an assertion. However, if there is an argument that you're uncomfortable with, for example, if it seems, I don't know, slightly sexist or slightly racist, but with reasoning for it, like, actually, statistically, a lot of immigrants commit crime, or people from this ethnicity or whatever commit crime, you might be personally uncomfortable, and you might personally decide to tell that team in personal feedback that they shouldn't have run that argument. But if it's justified, you want to allow that argument to exist in the debate, and you want to allow other teams to refute it. Likely they will be able to. Even if they don't, you can still say, this is an argument I maybe wouldn't run, and I would advise you to be more careful in your language. However, in this case, I don't feel that it was contested, if that makes sense. Having said that, there are exceptions, and there are some equity violations that visibly affect the debate. And as I said here, the principle of non-intervention might mean that you actually, after that speaker is done speaking, you might want to give people a reminder. For instance, you might want to say, please refrain from using that language, please refrain from those kinds of arguments that can be upsetting to individuals in the room. But as much as possible, you don't want to cause damage in the debate, you don't want to upset people, and you don't want to cause disruption. So if you don't have to, it's always better to talk to the teams afterwards. And there have been many times when I've heard quite offensive arguments, often by freshers who just, like novices that just honestly don't know better. It's just something they think. And that's actually a really good learning opportunity for you to be able to explain to them why that kind of argument can be upsetting for people and also is unlikely to be very persuasive and help them win debates. So save that for afterwards in the adjudication. But don't give people minus points because they said something you disagree with, unless it's inherently unpersuasive. I hope that makes sense. So if there's no other questions, we'll probably call it up here. I think you guys are back. So is everything good? Are we good to go? Yeah? Okay. I'm going to assume it's okay to go. Brilliant, guys. Thanks a lot for having me over. If you have any questions, then just pop me a line. And best of luck in the national tournament. I hope it goes really well. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. We're off.
summary to the number of evidence. Well, she came back third summer and she got really excited.